In the popular imagination, Victorian fashion is often reduced to lace, frills, and dainty silhouettes. But what most people fail to realize is that these garments were not simply dresses at all. They were feats of structural engineering worn on the body. To call them clothes is almost misleading, because what women of the mid to late 19th century navigated daily was a kind of wearable architecture, complete with frames of steel, intricate layering systems, and fabrics stretched and molded into precise geometries. At the foundation of this elaborate construction lay the linen shift, a deceptively simple garment that worked as a protective base layer, safeguarding the ornate outer gowns from sweat and body oils. But above this modest start, each additional piece added weight, restriction, and complexity, until the wearer was essentially encased within an engineered shell. The corset, famously maligned and mythologized, did more than nip the waist into the coveted hourglass shape. When worn over years, it reshaped women's very rib cages, compressing the thoracic cavity so significantly that breathing deeply became not only unfashionable, but nearly impossible. Beyond the corset came layer upon layer of petticoats, each strategically adding bulk and sculpting the skirt into the bell-like forms celebrated in the period's art and photography. But it was the crinoline, introduced in the 1850s, that transformed the ensemble from heavy layering into mechanical marvel. A cage of steel hoops suspended from fabric tapes, it could expand to 6 feet across, pushing the boundaries of personal space to absurd extremes. Imagine walking through a doorway, squeezing into a carriage, or even attempting to sit. Every ordinary movement became a calculation of geometry and grace. To accommodate these new spatial realities, furniture itself had to evolve. Armchairs were redesigned without arms, benches widened, dining arrangements reconsidered, all in deference to the steel cages that dictated how a woman might enter and inhabit a room. This was fashion, as a reshaper of architecture and behavior alike, dictating not only how women looked but how they moved, where they could fit, and even how they interacted with others in physical space. And yet, within the rigid constraints of these wearable machines, society expected women to glide as though entirely unencumbered, to perform elegance as if it required no effort at all. What appears to us today as impractical excess was, in its own time, a public demonstration of discipline, wealth, and refinement, a physical proof of one's ability to endure the hidden costs of beauty. To wear such a structure daily was not merely to dress, but to inhabit a kind of personal stage set where every gesture, walking, sitting, turning, even breathing, was choreographed by steel and fabric. The Victorian woman was not just clothed, she was constructed, and through her construction, she enacted a vision of society that prized visible grandeur over invisible comfort. This is why, when we peer back at photographs of the era and admire the silhouettes, we are in truth looking at a marvel of engineering, one that speaks volumes about power, gender, and the lengths to which fashion can go to transform the human body into architecture. When we picture the corset, our modern imagination usually leaps to caricature. Fainting women, crushed organs, and a universal symbol of patriarchal oppression. But the truth of this garment, the defining piece of Victorian fashion, is far more complex and in many ways stranger than the stereotypes suggest. The corset was not a trivial accessory nor a frivolous torture device. It was a deliberate instrument of bodily transformation, a tool through which Victorian society literally sculpted the female form into its chosen aesthetic ideal. Unlike the soft undergarments we associate with comfort, corsets were stiffened with whalebone or steel stays, designed to compress and redirect flesh until the torso resembled an hourglass, narrow-waisted and rigidly vertical. Worn tightly, often from adolescence onward, they did not merely restrict the body temporarily, but over time molded it in permanent ways. There are documented cases where women's rib cages adapted to years of pressure, bones bending inward to conform to the demands of fashion, reshaping the very architecture of the body to match cultural expectation. Breathing deeply in such conditions was not only unfashionable, but physiologically discouraged, and yet this restriction was presented as the pinnacle of refinement. To modern readers, this sounds like senseless cruelty. But in the Victorian mindset, endurance of physical constraint was proof of discipline, status, and self-control. A corseted woman was not just dressed, she was a walking declaration of her family's wealth and her own moral rectitude, signaling that she did not need to labor or exert herself as ordinary women did. Even the fainting couch, so often mocked as evidence of feminine fragility, had more to do with the social theater of restraint than with weakness itself. What makes the corset even more fascinating is how thoroughly it shaped behavior beyond the physical body. It dictated posture, forcing the wearer to stand upright, shoulders back, chest lifted, chin delicately angled. It choreographed every movement, how one sat, bent, or even gestured, turning ordinary existence into a performance of elegance. And beneath this performance, the garment carried contradictions. While derided as oppressive, many women embraced it as a tool of empowerment, claiming mastery over their public image and using the corset to project authority, allure, and social standing. Critics then, as now, debated whether corsetry was cruelty or choice, submission or power, but what cannot be denied is its profound impact. The corset blurred the line between clothing and anatomy, fashion and surgery, reshaping not only how women looked but how they were seen, how they moved, and how they breathed. To understand the Victorian corset is to recognize that it was never simply about style. It was about rewriting the human body itself, bending bone and flesh to the will of culture. And in that sense, the corset was less an accessory than a symbol of a society that prized appearances above comfort, architecture above anatomy, and endurance above ease. A society where women's very skeletons became silent testimonies to the power of fashion. When we imagine the crinoline, it often appears in our minds as nothing more than a whimsical detail of Victorian dress, a wide skirt swaying gracefully in portraits and costume dramas. But in reality, it was an extraordinary contraption that transformed not only women's fashion, but also the very spaces they inhabited. The crinoline was not fabric, but a cage, a framework of steel hoops suspended on tapes, expanding a woman's gown into a bell-like circumference that could stretch up to 6 feet across. To wear such a structure was to carry around a personal architecture, a moving edifice that reshaped everyday life in ways few of us consider today. Passing through narrow corridors, entering carriages, or simply attempting to sit became exercises in spatial negotiation, demanding precision and balance. Entire rooms had to be reimagined because of these garments. Doorways seemed smaller, hallways became bottlenecks, and furniture was forced to adapt. Chairs were redesigned without arms, benches widened, and even dining tables allowed extra clearance to prevent the collapse of fashion against wood and upholstery. In effect, the crinoline did not simply clothe women, it redrew the physical landscape of the Victorian home. And yet, this enormous structure, which we might expect to have been unbearable, was paradoxically embraced as liberating by many women of the era. Compared to the mountains of layered petticoats that preceded it, the crinoline, made of lightweight steel, actually reduced weight and heat, allowing skirts to achieve monumental volume without suffocating the wearer in fabric. It was, in a strange way, a technological innovation, a piece of wearable engineering that replaced cloth with metal, merging fashion with industry at the very height of the Industrial Revolution. Its size, however, introduced new challenges that went far beyond aesthetics. In crowded streets or public gatherings, women became like moving barricades, occupying twice the physical space of men, unintentionally asserting presence through sheer circumference. Satirical prints of the era mocked this absurdity, showing crinolines knocking over furniture, trapping men against walls, or ballooning in the wind like inverted umbrellas. But beneath the ridicule lay a profound truth. The crinoline redefined social dynamics, granting women both visibility and vulnerability. On one hand, it created a protective barrier, keeping suitors, strangers, and even family members at a respectful distance. On the other, it made women conspicuously immobile, reliant on assistance to move gracefully through a world not designed for 6-foot-wide skirts. Fires, too, became a terrifying hazard. Skirts of such breadth could sweep into open flames, and more than one tragic death was recorded when steel frames collapsed in heat and fabric ignited. Still, despite the dangers and the mockery, crinolines persisted for decades, celebrated as the epitome of fashion and modernity. They symbolized wealth, leisure, and the triumph of design over practicality, turning women into living monuments of style. What we see today as an eccentric relic of vanity was, in its time, both a technological marvel and a cultural statement, a cage of steel that made women at once grand, fragile, powerful, and confined, reshaping not only their bodies but the world around them. When we think about Victorian furniture, we tend to imagine ornate wooden chairs, elaborately carved tables, and drawing rooms filled with heavy upholstery. But rarely do we connect these furnishings to the radical demands of fashion. Yet the truth is that the mid-19th century saw not only a revolution in what women wore, but in how they inhabited their homes, and furniture itself was forced to adapt to the rise of the crinoline. The immense steel cages beneath women's skirts, stretching 5 or 6 feet in diameter, made ordinary sitting nearly impossible, and suddenly, centuries of furniture design collided with the demands of a single garment. Traditional armchairs became obsolete for fashionable women, their constricting sides unable to accommodate the expanding circumference of skirts. In response, craftsmen began producing armless chairs, wider benches, and sofas with low backs and generous proportions, pieces designed not for comfort in the modern sense, but for compatibility with the physics of steel hoops and layers of silk. Dining tables, too, had to evolve, their spacing and leg placement reconsidered so that women could approach them without collapsing their fashion into the woodwork. What looks to us like decorative whimsy, the vast skirts sweeping across parlors and ballrooms, was in fact a logistical challenge that reshaped domestic interiors. And this adaptation was not a trivial side note, but a significant cultural moment, one in which fashion dictated architecture, flipping the usual order of design on its head. Rooms were measured not in square feet of floor, but in how many crinolines could fit without chaos. Seating was arranged to prevent entanglement. Even social etiquette shifted, as hosts ensured that their guests had room to maneuver their elaborate attire. Satirists of the time mocked the absurdity, publishing cartoons of women wedged helplessly between pieces of furniture, skirts devouring entire parlors like living creatures. Yet these exaggerations reflected a real and persistent truth. Clothing was dictating the very blueprint of Victorian domestic life. More than that, the furniture changes revealed deeper class distinctions. To own a home spacious enough to accommodate crinolines was to signal wealth, while families of modest means faced daily frustrations in cramped rooms ill-suited to skirts that spanned half their living space. Thus, fashion became not just a matter of personal adornment, but a symbol of architectural privilege. When we examine surviving pieces of Victorian furniture today, wide settees, peculiar armless chairs, unusually deep benches, we often admire them as decorative antiques, missing the functional story behind their design. These were not aesthetic experiments, but accommodations, tangible evidence of how far a culture would go to support an ideal of beauty. The crinoline was not worn only on the body, it was embedded in the home itself, dictating carpentry, floor plans, and even the choreography of daily life. It is no exaggeration to say that Victorian furniture is a silent archive of fashion's dominion, the wood and upholstery bearing witness to an era when style did not merely influence society, but physically restructured its environment, one chair and one drawing room at a time. When we contemplate the logistics of the Victorian toilet, our modern minds often stumble on the absurdity. How could a woman, swathed in 20 pounds of fabric, steel hoops, corsetry, and lace, possibly manage one of the most basic human functions? Yet what seems laughable to us today was, for Victorian women, a carefully refined choreography, a private ritual that required no less precision than a stage performance. Beneath the grand sweep of crinolines and the rigid embrace of corsets, the act of relieving oneself became an exercise in engineering and ingenuity, and far from being a humiliating struggle, it was handled with a practiced elegance that society expected women to master. The chamber pot, that unsung hero of 19th century life, was designed with this challenge in mind. Its oval shape and smooth interior were not aesthetic accidents, but functional necessities, perfectly suited to sliding discreetly beneath the towering architecture of petticoats and hoops. Wealthier households elevated this humble vessel into an art form, concealing it within fine wooden commodes, chairs with hidden compartments, and furniture crafted as much for secrecy as for beauty. For women, the process itself was less about brute force. There was no lifting of 20 pounds of skirts and corsets in awkward haste, and more about subtle adjustments, careful posture, and precise balance. With trained motions, layers of fabric could be nudged aside, the body angled just so, and the task completed without ever removing a garment. No zippers, no buttons, just control of one's own body within the cage of fashion. Servants, meanwhile, played the invisible role of stagehands, emptying and cleaning pots with discretion, interpreting the silent code of lids left open or closed, ensuring that the entire system ran without public acknowledgement. At grand balls or in aristocratic houses, retiring rooms were staffed like backstage dressing areas, where maids assisted their mistresses with the maneuvering of skirts and frames, always maintaining the illusion of effortless grace. What strikes us as comic difficulty was, in fact, a mark of social discipline. The ability to maintain composure even when handling bodily needs was a testament to refinement. And paradoxically, the bulk of fashion provided its own form of privacy. Under the vast canopy of fabric, much could happen unseen. Yet there was also risk. A misstep in balance, a poorly placed chamber pot, or the gust of a draft through voluminous skirts could turn a discreet act into a public embarrassment. These mishaps, whispered about in satirical columns and caricatured in cartoons, remind us that fashion did not merely complicate life, but transformed it into a performance where even the toilet was part of the script. To understand Victorian bathroom logistics is to recognize that women of the era were not passive prisoners of their clothes, but skilled navigators of them, turning restriction into ritual and necessity into yet another arena where grace was expected to triumph over gravity, privacy over practicality, and composure over the messy realities of the human body. In the silent world of Victorian domestic life, where appearances mattered more than nearly anything else, even the most private acts were shrouded in ritual and coded gestures, and one of the most ingenious systems of communication emerged not in parlors or dining halls, but in the realm of chamber pots. To the casual observer, a chamber pot with a lid might seem a simple container, a practical object designed to mask odor and preserve modesty. But in truth, the lid itself became a vital instrument of silent dialogue between mistress and servant. In an age when discretion was paramount, words about bodily needs were rarely spoken aloud in polite households, and so a closed lid became a signal, precise, unspoken, and universally understood, that the vessel was ready to be emptied. This small piece of domestic theater illustrates how the Victorians transformed necessity into performance, embedding even sanitation within the elaborate choreography of class and etiquette. Servants were expected to read these subtle signs as fluently as a conductor reads a score, interpreting the state of the pot without inquiry, entering and leaving rooms with practiced invisibility, removing and replacing the object without ever acknowledging its true function. For wealthier families, the chamber pot was hidden inside exquisitely crafted furniture, mahogany cabinets, intricately carved commodes, or deceptively elegant chairs with concealed compartments, allowing an object of bodily necessity to masquerade as an article of art. Yet no matter how beautifully disguised, its secret life depended on the lid, that unassuming disc of porcelain or wood, which transformed odor control into language and utility into etiquette. It is telling that such a system arose in a society where silence and appearance were sacrosanct. A woman of standing would never call across a hallway to demand her pot be emptied, nor would a servant ever risk the impropriety of asking. Instead, the exchange occurred in the quiet ritual of lids opened or closed, a silent pact of mutual understanding rooted in the rigid hierarchies of the household. This unspoken code also reveals the extraordinary burden placed on servants, who became the backstage crew of domestic life, tasked with handling the most intimate remnants of their employer's existence without ever acknowledging their labor. Timing was crucial. Pots had to be checked and removed before their presence became noticeable, emptied before inconvenience arose, and replaced so discreetly that the lady of the house could proceed as though nothing had occurred. In this way, chamber pots with lids were not just household items, but symbols of Victorian obsession with secrecy, order, and performance, objects that embodied the peculiar paradox of the age, a society that constructed elaborate rituals to conceal the very things it could not live without. What we dismiss today as a crude relic of the pre-plumbing era was, for the Victorians, an object of both necessity and etiquette, a vessel transformed into a language of silence, ensuring that even the most human of needs could be managed without breaking the fragile illusion of grace. In the grand drawing rooms and private chambers of wealthy Victorian households, nothing was ever quite what it seemed, and few objects better capture this culture of disguise than the secret furniture built to conceal the most unmentionable of necessities: the chamber pot. At a time when appearances dictated social survival and propriety demanded that even natural bodily needs remain invisible, ingenious craftsmen devised elegant solutions that transformed functional objects into pieces of art. A carved mahogany commode might appear at first glance to be a handsome cabinet, its polished surfaces gleaming in candlelight, yet within lay a hidden compartment designed to hold a porcelain pot. Upholstered chairs, too, were constructed with hinged seats, allowing their occupants to relieve themselves without ever leaving the apparent dignity of their surroundings. These were not crude contraptions, but finely made furnishings, often adorned with the same artistry as any other piece in the room: ornate woodwork, brass fittings, embroidered cushions, so that no guest could suspect the true purpose lurking beneath the veneer of elegance. The concealment was not only about modesty, but about the seamless maintenance of the Victorian illusion that life itself was an unbroken performance of grace. To acknowledge the chamber pot openly would have shattered the delicate facade of refinement, so instead it was embedded within the very architecture of the home, hidden in plain sight. For the ladies and gentlemen who lived in these spaces, such furniture offered a way to navigate the practical realities of life while preserving an unbroken image of composure. But for the servants who maintained them, these objects became tools of silent labor. A maid might approach a commode chair, recognize the signals of its use, and remove its hidden vessel with practiced precision, all without so much as a word exchanged. Timing, discretion, and invisibility defined the entire process, ensuring that the cycle of use and cleaning unfolded like the backstage mechanics of a theater performance, hidden from the audience but essential to the illusion. These secret furnishings also spoke volumes about class distinction. To own such cleverly designed pieces was to broadcast wealth and sophistication, to demonstrate not only the means to commission bespoke furniture, but the cultural awareness to demand that even necessity be aestheticized. In modest homes, a chamber pot might sit openly beneath a bed, practical and unadorned, but in the homes of the elite, the very same object was absorbed into the decorative landscape, its presence denied by layers of craftsmanship and polish. Today, when we encounter these items in museums or antique shops, they may strike us as curiosities, amusing relics of an age obsessed with propriety, but in their time they were central to the choreography of Victorian life, embodying the era's determination to transform every aspect of existence into theater. A commode chair was never just a chair, and a cabinet never just a cabinet. They were props in a society that demanded beauty, secrecy, and control in equal measure, where even the most private acts had to be cloaked in the elegance of wood and upholstery. Among the many curiosities of Victorian domestic life, perhaps none is more revealing of the period's obsession with propriety and disguise than the invention of secret furniture, exquisitely crafted pieces designed to conceal chamber pots in plain sight. In an age when the mention of bodily functions was considered indecorous, and when the home itself was treated as a stage upon which every gesture was a performance of refinement, it was unthinkable for an object as vulgar as a pot to stand exposed beneath a bed. Instead, ingenuity and craftsmanship combined to create chairs with hidden compartments, cabinets with cleverly engineered doors, and commodes so beautifully made that they could pass for fine pieces of decorative art. A mahogany armchair, with its upholstered seat and elegant curves, might at first glance appear to be a testament to wealth and taste, yet its hinged lid revealed a porcelain vessel discreetly nestled inside. In wealthy households, such objects were often masterpieces, as much a display of artistry as they were a practical necessity, with carved panels, polished veneers, and even gilt embellishments ensuring that no visitor could guess their true function. This blending of function and deception was not only about comfort, but about the maintenance of social illusion. A lady could preserve her dignity, servants could carry out their duties without awkward conversation, and the home could sustain its aura of genteel order uninterrupted. For the servants tasked with managing these hidden pots, the furniture represented both convenience and burden, requiring skill to maneuver quietly, precision to clean thoroughly, and discretion to avoid drawing attention to the intimate realities they contained. In a sense, they became stagehands in an elaborate domestic theater, ensuring that the performance of elegance could continue seamlessly. To modern eyes, such concealment may seem absurdly elaborate, but in its time, it represented the intersection of design, class, and culture, a physical manifestation of the Victorian determination to keep private functions invisible while elevating even the most mundane object into a symbol of status. Where poorer households tolerated simple pots tucked under beds or behind screens, the wealthy transformed necessity into art, commissioning bespoke furniture that blurred the line between ornament and utility. And yet, these objects tell us more than simply how people lived. They reveal how people wished to be seen. A commode chair or disguised cabinet was less about hiding a pot than about preserving a narrative, the story of a household untouched by vulgarity, of a family whose existence appeared as polished as their furniture. Today, when these pieces appear in museums or antique shops, they often draw amused reactions, curiosities admired for their ingenuity, but in their own time they were essential instruments in the choreography of respectability. They remind us that the Victorians did not simply live among beautiful things. They demanded that beauty conceal life itself, that even the most basic human needs be shrouded in carved oak, velvet, and brass, so that the performance of refinement could remain uninterrupted no matter what occurred behind the polished facade. At the height of the Victorian social season, when great houses opened their doors to glittering balls and soirees that stretched late into the night, the spectacle of grandeur did not end with the music and the chandeliers. It extended behind the scenes into spaces few modern readers would ever imagine: the retiring rooms. These were not simple powder rooms as we might conceive them today, but elaborate sanctuaries designed specifically to accommodate the immense logistical challenges of women's fashion. A ballroom filled with hundreds of crinolines, corsets, and silk gowns required more than just music and lighting. It demanded backstage infrastructure, and the retiring room functioned as precisely that, a kind of private theater where the machinery of elegance could be maintained. Here, maids awaited with quiet readiness, not merely to assist in adjusting gowns or holding cloaks, but to orchestrate the delicate maneuvers of skirts 6 feet wide, steel hoops that caught on furniture, and layers of fabric that weighed as much as a small child. A lady could retreat with dignity to this hidden chamber where she might refresh her appearance, discreetly manage personal needs, or simply rest from the physical burden of her attire, all under the vigilant and invisible assistance of servants trained in the choreography of discretion. What we often overlook is that these rooms were themselves part of the spectacle, outfitted with elegant furnishings, mirrors, and carefully chosen decor, ensuring that the aura of refinement was never broken, even in private. The maids who staffed them worked like stagehands, swiftly adjusting crinolines, arranging fabric, and positioning chamber pots when required, their every movement aimed at preserving the illusion of effortlessness when the lady re-emerged into the ballroom. For the guests, the process appeared seamless. No one saw the frantic coordination, the subtle lifting of hoops, the whispered instructions, only the final image of women gliding across polished floors as though fashion imposed no weight or restriction. In reality, these retiring rooms were sites of ingenuity, where posture, balance, and wardrobe mechanics were rehearsed and perfected anew with every visit. They also reinforced social hierarchy. The upper classes enjoyed this private sphere of assistance, while women of more modest backgrounds had no such infrastructure and endured their gowns without relief. Thus, the retiring room was more than a convenience. It was a statement of status, a symbol that one's household could afford not only the luxury of grand attire, but also the hidden labor necessary to sustain it. Satirical magazines of the time occasionally hinted at the secret dramas that unfolded within these spaces, skirts collapsing, hoops entangled, whispered laughter as servants rushed to avert disaster. But in polite society, these stories remained unspoken, buried beneath the polished surface of Victorian decorum. To study these retiring rooms is to glimpse the machinery behind the performance, the spaces where women navigated the conflict between fashion's demands and human necessity. They remind us that elegance in the Victorian era was not spontaneous but carefully staged, supported by hidden rooms, silent servants, and an unbroken commitment to ensuring that, when the music swelled and eyes turned toward the dancers, every woman appeared not burdened by steel and silk, but buoyed by grace itself. One of the most startling truths about Victorian fashion, startling at least to the modern imagination, is that for much of the 19th century, women did not wear what we would recognize today as underwear. Beneath the monumental crinolines, layers of petticoats, and tightly laced corsets, there was often no additional garment covering the body because the sheer bulk and architecture of the skirts were themselves deemed sufficient protection. To a society obsessed with modesty, this paradox might seem bewildering, but the logic was simple. With 6 feet of steel and fabric extending outward in every direction, a woman was considered shielded from sight, her body encased in layers that were not easily breached. Yet this absence of undergarments was not without consequences. The precariousness of modesty became apparent in windy streets when a gust could flip a crinoline inside out like an umbrella, exposing what convention dictated should never be revealed. Satirical prints of the time seized upon these mishaps, mocking the absurdity of a fashion that both exaggerated modesty and risked humiliating exposure. The problem grew so notorious that society was forced to reconsider its standards, and out of this tension emerged one of the most peculiar yet ingenious garments of the Victorian age: the split drawer. Unlike modern underwear, these were not closed trousers, but 2 separate leg coverings joined only at the waistband, leaving an open seam in the center. This design served a dual purpose. It preserved a sense of modesty while walking or sitting, and at the same time allowed women to manage personal needs without the impossible task of removing layers of skirts, hoops, and petticoats. It was a compromise between propriety and practicality, and it reveals the complex negotiations women had to make between the ideals imposed upon them and the realities of their daily lives. The introduction of split drawers marked a quiet revolution, not just in clothing but in social norms, acknowledging that even in a culture obsessed with appearances, functionality could not be ignored forever. Still, the idea that generations of women moved through the world without what we consider a basic garment remains one of the strangest footnotes in fashion history, a reminder that modesty itself is a cultural construct, shifting with time and circumstance. To the Victorians, the absence of underwear was not indecent, but logical, hidden beneath an impenetrable fortress of fabric, and only later, when mishaps became too common, did the balance between modesty and necessity shift toward innovation. What might strike us today as shocking was, for them, simply the natural order, another illustration of how profoundly fashion dictates not only how people look but how they live, how they move, and even how they define decency. The story of the absent underwear is not a trivial curiosity. It is a window into the Victorian mind, a culture that clothed women in cages of steel while leaving them uncovered at the very core, embodying the contradictions of an age that elevated modesty yet constantly danced on the edge of exposure. Among the many hazards of Victorian fashion, one of the most comically humiliating yet genuinely perilous was the effect of the wind upon the vast steel-framed crinolines that women wore with such pride. These structures, designed to hold skirts in the fashionable bell shape of the mid-19th century, could span nearly 6 feet across, transforming the wearer into a walking architecture of fabric and steel, but they also acted, quite unintentionally, like sails or umbrellas. A gentle breeze might set the skirt swaying, but a sudden gust could flip the entire contraption upward, turning a garment meant to symbolize dignity and modesty into a source of scandalous exposure. Contemporary newspapers and satirical magazines delighted in reporting such mishaps, sketching cartoons of ladies helplessly upturned in the street, their underlayers, or lack thereof, on full display to shocked passers-by. The irony was stark. Garments intended to exaggerate propriety became the very instruments of its undoing, laying bare the contradictions of a culture obsessed with appearances. And for much of the period, the problem was compounded by the fact that women often wore no undergarments beneath their voluminous skirts, considering the sheer mass of fabric sufficient protection. Thus, a single gust of wind could erase the illusion of privacy in an instant. These accidents were not merely comic, however. They revealed the impracticality and danger of garments that transformed women into both spectacles and victims of their own fashion. Reports exist of women caught in sudden storms, their skirts ballooning uncontrollably, tangling them in hoops of steel or toppling them to the ground, sometimes even causing fatal accidents near carriages, open flames, or crowded streets. Yet society's response was not to abandon the crinoline, but to adapt to its flaws. Out of necessity, new garments such as split drawers emerged, offering coverage while still allowing women to manage personal needs within their cages of fabric. These innovations represented not indulgence, but survival, a way to maintain modesty in a world where one's dignity could be undone by nothing more than a change in the weather. Still, the cultural fascination with the flying crinoline endured, with prints and anecdotes circulating widely, cementing the image of women at once elevated by their fashion and betrayed by it. To the Victorians, these episodes underscored both the absurdity and the fragility of their social codes. Modesty, so rigidly enforced in drawing rooms and parlors, could vanish in an instant on a gusty street corner. To us, the idea of fashion vulnerable to the wind may seem amusing, but to them it was a daily reminder of the tension between the performance of propriety and the unpredictable realities of the world. The crinoline was not merely clothing, but a symbol of status, discipline, and cultural expectation, and the wind, indifferent to society's illusions, exposed just how precarious that symbol really was. In every gust that sent skirts skyward, the Victorian project of modesty was revealed as both magnificent and absurd, as fragile as silk and as unstable as the steel hoops that tried to hold it in place. Among the many ingenious adaptations of Victorian fashion, few are as little discussed yet as revolutionary as the invention of split drawers, a garment that fundamentally redefined both modesty and practicality in the mid-19th century. To modern sensibilities, the idea of open-seamed underclothing may seem odd, even shocking, but in the context of women navigating crinolines, corsets, and layers of petticoats, it was nothing short of essential. Before their introduction, most women wore no undergarments in the modern sense, relying instead on the sheer bulk of fabric for protection, a practice that left them vulnerable to the vagaries of wind and chance, as well as to the monumental challenge of relieving themselves without disrobing entirely. Split drawers, however, offered a clever solution. Two separate legs joined only at the waistband, with a gap between them that allowed access without the need to lift or remove heavy skirts. This simple innovation transformed the private routines of Victorian women, allowing them to use chamber pots discreetly with the assistance of posture and fabric management rather than exhaustive effort. At the same time, the drawers provided an additional layer of coverage against the possibility of crinolines flipping upward in a gust of wind, sparing women the mortification that had become a frequent subject of satire in illustrated magazines of the era. What makes the garment so fascinating is that it straddled the boundary between modesty and exposure. Its very openness would have seemed indecent if viewed in isolation, yet within the fortress of steel hoops and fabric, it was both invisible and indispensable. Fashion historians note that the adoption of split drawers coincided with the growing complexity of women's wardrobes, and the increasing expectation that they embody grace even under impossible conditions. And so this garment became a kind of secret tool in the performance of refinement. It was not universally embraced at once. Some moralists considered them scandalous, a violation of propriety even in their unseen state. But among the upper classes especially, they became standard, passed down from mother to daughter as part of the quiet education in how to survive the labyrinth of Victorian dress. To wear split drawers was to acknowledge, implicitly, the absurdity of fashion's demands and the necessity of compromise, an admission that elegance could not be maintained without concessions to the realities of the human body. And yet, their design was ingenious in its simplicity, requiring no buttons, hooks, or zippers, just fabric cut and sewn in a way that turned absence into function. Today, these garments are remembered less than corsets or crinolines, but in truth, they represent one of the era's most striking examples of adaptation, a moment when women's ingenuity and necessity reshaped the language of modesty itself. Split drawers remind us that Victorian fashion, for all its grandeur, was not simply about appearances, but about survival within a cage of fabric and steel, and that even the most intimate garments carried with them the imprint of a society negotiating the fragile balance between decorum and practicality. The absence of modern toilet paper in the Victorian era is a detail that often surprises us today, but it reveals much about the ingenuity, class distinctions, and unspoken realities of 19th century life. Though the first commercial toilet paper rolls appeared in the mid-1800s, they were rare luxuries, far from the everyday necessity we now consider them. For the vast majority of people, sanitation was handled with whatever was at hand, and the choice of material spoke volumes about social standing. In working-class households, newspapers, catalogs, or discarded scraps of printed paper were the most common substitutes, their rough texture tolerated because practicality outweighed comfort. The ubiquity of print culture in this period meant that discarded pages from broadsheets and penny journals were always available, and in some homes, reading material served a double purpose before being relegated to the privy. In rural areas, nature itself supplied the alternatives: soft leaves, handfuls of moss, or cloth rags that could be washed and reused. These methods were unremarkable at the time, part of the unglamorous but accepted routines of everyday existence. Yet, in wealthier households, where appearances and refinement were paramount, more elegant solutions prevailed. Affluent families employed small squares of fine linen cloth, carefully cut and hemmed, which were washed and laundered alongside other household linens. This practice not only offered greater comfort, but also symbolized gentility, for to wipe with soft fabric rather than newsprint marked one as belonging to a class above necessity. The laundering of these cloths fell, of course, to the servants, whose labor ensured that the illusion of cleanliness and refinement remained uninterrupted. What might strike us now as unsanitary or labor-intensive was, in fact, a status marker, a way of transforming even the most private acts into another arena for social distinction. The existence of such practices also highlights the Victorian preoccupation with concealment. Bodily functions were rarely spoken of, and yet they were meticulously managed with household systems designed to mask the realities of waste. Powder, perfumed water, and careful laundering served to maintain an aura of freshness, ensuring that even sanitation bore the imprint of decorum. The absence of toilet paper as we know it today thus becomes more than a curious fact. It is a window into how Victorians negotiated the balance between necessity and propriety, between the raw facts of biology and the polished surfaces of social life. While the working poor relied on scraps and leaves, and the middle classes on whatever printed paper they could spare, the wealthy literally softened the experience with linen, reinforcing hierarchies through intimate habits invisible to outsiders. That such distinctions extended into the privy tells us much about the reach of class in Victorian society, where even the smallest details of daily life became opportunities to assert status. To us, the idea of reusing cloth squares may seem inconvenient or even shocking, but to them it was a mark of dignity, an unspoken assurance that refinement touched every corner of existence. In this way, the story of toilet paper's absence is also the story of a culture that insisted on turning even necessity into performance, and in doing so, revealed just how profoundly appearances governed Victorian life. In Victorian society, where appearances defined reputation and fashion was both armor and performance, the art of keeping clothing clean was not a matter of frequent washing, but of strategic maintenance, an entire system built upon the logic of preservation rather than renewal. The magnificent gowns of the era, often constructed from silks, satins, and delicate lace, were far too fragile and costly to endure the rigors of repeated laundering, and so they were rarely, if ever, immersed in water. Instead, households developed an elaborate routine to keep garments looking fresh while avoiding damage. Outer dresses were carefully brushed to remove dust, aired by hanging them in open spaces to release odors, and treated with powders designed to absorb oils and refresh the fabric without weakening its fibers. Stains were spot-cleaned with painstaking care, but full washing was reserved for the sturdy inner layers that bore the brunt of daily wear. Linen shifts, chemises, and later the practical split drawers acted as sacrificial shields, absorbing sweat and bodily oils while protecting the costly fabrics above. These undergarments were washed regularly, becoming the true front line of hygiene, while the gowns they guarded remained largely untouched by soap and water. In this sense, the Victorian wardrobe functioned as a system of layered defense, with each tier serving a different purpose: inner layers for sanitation, outer layers for display. The process of laundering even these simpler garments, however, was arduous and labor-intensive, often involving boiling water, lye soap, scrubbing boards, and hours of physical labor performed by servants or laundresses. The distinction between what was washed and what was merely maintained also highlighted class divides. The wealthy could afford multiple shifts in petticoats to rotate through, ensuring a steady cycle of cleanliness, while poorer women often had far fewer garments, forcing them to endure discomfort and risk of odor or staining. This layered strategy was not merely practical, but emblematic of Victorian culture's obsession with concealment and control. Just as emotions, bodily functions, and private struggles were hidden beneath a facade of poise, so too was dirt hidden beneath protective layers, with the outward dress remaining an immaculate symbol of grace. Even the scents of the wardrobe became part of this illusion, with sachets of lavender or rose petals placed in drawers to mask any hint of decay and powders dusted between fabrics to maintain a fresh aura. To the modern eye, accustomed to the convenience of washing machines and disposable products, such practices may seem unhygienic, but in their time, they represented ingenuity within constraint, a careful balance between preserving fragile beauty and managing the unrelenting realities of human life. The strategy of Victorian laundry reminds us that cleanliness was never just about health, but about dignity, about sustaining the illusion of perfection in a world where every visible detail mattered. To maintain an unwashed gown as though it were spotless was to perform refinement itself, turning clothing into a metaphor for the society that wore it, immaculate on the surface, complex and laborious beneath, always managing the tension between appearance and reality. Where the very mention of menstruation was cloaked in silence and euphemism, women endured their monthly cycles without the convenience of modern sanitary products, relying instead on homemade systems of cloth, belts, and ingenuity to preserve both hygiene and dignity. The typical arrangement was a belt and pad system consisting of a fabric belt worn around the waist, from which absorbent materials, flannel, cotton, or other scraps of soft cloth, were suspended. These pads were not disposable but reusable, washed discreetly and often many times a day, a routine that demanded privacy, timing, and considerable effort. For women of modest means, resources were scarce, and so rags were pressed into service, while those in rural communities sometimes used natural fillers such as moss or wool, materials that were absorbent but also uncomfortable and prone to causing irritation. The wealthier classes, by contrast, could afford finer fabrics and sometimes employed ladies' maids to assist with laundering and preparation, further illustrating the deep class divide that marked even the most intimate aspects of women's lives. Yet regardless of social status, the management of menstruation required extraordinary coordination, especially when layered beneath corsets, crinolines, and petticoats that weighed upwards of 20 pounds. Changing cloths discreetly meant maneuvering within a literal cage of steel and fabric, transforming a biological necessity into a logistical feat of posture and subtlety. Written records are sparse, for the topic was rarely discussed openly, but surviving accounts suggest that women changed their cloths multiple times a day, slipping away to private chambers or relying on retiring rooms at social gatherings where maids acted as silent attendants in this hidden performance. This silence itself is telling. Menstruation, though universal, was treated as a matter of utmost discretion, never acknowledged in polite society, and carefully hidden within the daily routines of the household. Yet beneath this silence was a system passed down through generations, mothers teaching daughters, maids guiding mistresses, each ensuring the cycle of knowledge continued without ever breaching the surface calm of Victorian decorum. The challenges were immense. Laundry was labor-intensive, water had to be boiled, cloth scrubbed, dried, and reused, often in conditions far from hygienic by modern standards. Still, women carried on with astonishing resilience, managing their cycles while fulfilling social obligations, maintaining households, or attending public functions, all without betraying the slightest hint of discomfort. The absence of commercial sanitary products did not mean a lack of solutions. Rather, it meant that solutions were personal, laborious, and embedded in a culture that demanded invisibility from women's bodies. In this way, menstruation in the Victorian era was not merely a private matter, but a reflection of broader cultural values. The insistence on silence, the reliance on domestic labor, the burden of appearance maintained at any cost. To study these practices is to uncover a hidden layer of women's history, one that speaks to quiet endurance and ingenuity, a world where natural cycles were carefully managed behind the scenes, ensuring that the visible performance of grace and composure remained unbroken, even as the realities of the body demanded constant attention beneath the cages of steel and silk. In the Victorian world, where silence and discretion defined nearly every aspect of a woman's existence, knowledge about managing the hidden realities of hygiene and clothing was not written in manuals or taught in schools, but passed quietly, almost invisibly, from woman to woman, forming a chain of instruction that operated beneath the surface of polite society. Mothers were the first custodians of this tradition, guiding daughters through the mysteries of corsetry, menstruation, and the labyrinth of layers that defined a proper wardrobe, teaching them the delicate choreography of lifting crinolines, adjusting posture, or discreetly changing cloths without disturbing their outward grace. This education was intimate and unspoken, a blend of demonstration and whispered advice, never acknowledged in public but essential for survival within the constraints of fashion and expectation. Alongside maternal instruction came the expertise of servants, particularly ladies' maids, who held an extraordinary depth of practical knowledge about clothing maintenance, stain removal, laundering reusable cloths, and assisting with the mechanics of dressing and undressing. These maids acted as silent partners in their mistresses' lives, offering guidance and intervention at moments of difficulty, yet always in a manner that preserved the illusion of effortlessness. Their work required not only skill but discretion. They became keepers of secrets, ensuring that the private struggles of women remained invisible to the outside world. This transmission of knowledge created a hidden curriculum of womanhood, one that bound generations together through experience rather than public discourse. Unlike the grand narratives of politics or science, which were written down and debated, these lessons existed in the shadows, preserved through ritual, repetition, and trust. It was an education in resilience, teaching women how to maintain dignity while balancing on the knife edge of social scrutiny, where the slightest misstep could collapse the facade of refinement. The very silence that surrounded these practices highlights the paradox of Victorian culture. While appearances of purity and perfection were relentlessly demanded, the means of achieving them were shrouded in secrecy, as though acknowledging the body's realities would tarnish the image of elegance. Yet it was precisely through these networks of women, mothers to daughters, mistresses to maids, that survival within the cages of steel and silk was possible. Without this chain of instruction, the elaborate fashions of the age would have been unwearable, their logistical challenges insurmountable. What emerges from this hidden history is a portrait of solidarity and continuity, a testament to how women preserve dignity not by denying the body, but by quietly mastering its management within the harsh strictures of culture. The unspoken lessons of hygiene and dress remind us that history is not only written in grand events, but also in the whispered exchanges between generations, in the practical wisdom carried silently through time, ensuring that the performance of refinement could continue unbroken, even as the realities of the human body pressed unrelentingly beneath layers of lace, linen, and steel.